in the value chain of our efforts to fight back against the construction mafia and extortionists and those that seek to stop our progress on infrastructure sites across the country. I'm very grateful to Cabinet for approving the Integrated Social Facilitation Framework as a binding national policy instrument, which is a major step in moving forward from policy development to formal government implementation. Since the Durban Declaration in December 2024, our work has shifted from establishing coordination mechanisms to making sure that those mechanisms are used effectively across the sector. It is the next phase of our fight against the construction mafia. And in this next phase, we will continue to focus on restoring the rule of law, order, and confidence into our construction sites. And it is the next phase in our work to ensure that communities are properly engaged, that legitimate local participation is protected, and that criminals can no longer exploit community frustration to hijack construction projects. When I entered office in July 2024, one of the first and clearest threats facing public infrastructure delivery was the so-called construction mafia. It was clear to me then, as it remains clear to me now, that South Africa cannot turn itself into a construction site if construction sites are controlled by criminals. At that time, the problem was no longer isolated. What had begun in KwaZulu-Natal had spread to most provinces across the country. Contractors, developers, public entities, and investors were raising the same concern. Projects were being stopped, workers were being intimidated, in some cases assaulted, violently so, equipment was being damaged or stolen, and companies were being forced to pay money or surrender work to people who had no lawful claim to it. These syndicates were not only delaying projects, but they were increasing the costs for the state and for project developers. They were deterring investment, and they were threatening the lives of workers, and in some cases, project managers and construction owners. I remember we had that terrible case of a senior executive in Durban who had been shot 6 times on site, and thank God managed to survive. But most importantly and concerningly, they were robbing communities of their infrastructure. They were turning the legitimate need for local participation into a weapon of extortion and extraction. So shortly after my appointment, I visited and engaged on a number of projects where that threat had become very real. In KwaZulu-Natal, I was briefed on how construction mafia activity had resurfaced and how violent these disruptions had become. At the Umkomazi Water project, an altercation linked a matter linked to the construction mafia had resulted in the deaths of 3 people and the assault of another person. That for me was a defining moment and a wake-up call. It confirmed that this was not just about procurement inconvenience, it was not just a community protest, and it was not a labor dispute. It was organized criminality, and it required an organized national response. At the time, the country was already living with the consequences of years of weak coordination, inconsistent reporting, poor project-level community engagement, and far too little consequence management. The widely cited figure remains that more than 180 infrastructure and construction projects worth nearly 63 billion rand had been disrupted, delayed, or affected by extortion activity in the years leading up to our intervention. Those figures represented roads, schools, delayed water infrastructure, public buildings being stalled, private investment being lost, workers sent home, and communities left waiting. It was therefore clear that the old approach was not working, and for too long we had treated construction disruptions as isolated site incidents. One contractor would report a problem, one municipality would try to negotiate it, another project manager would try to keep the site open, The police would respond, open a case, but nothing would be done. And then the networks behind those disruptions continued. They were incredibly, and they are incredibly sophisticated, and often, and I've said this, that they are politically connected. And they were learning how to embed themselves, not only through open violence, but through subcontracting arrangements, local participation structures, security contracts, front companies, and self-appointed community representatives. They became incredibly sophisticated. So we had to change our approach. We had to move from isolated responses to national coordination, and we had to move from private fear, which often wasn't being reported, to public confrontation. We had to move from negotiation to consequence management. We also had to move from reacting to site interventions to preventing the conditions that allow them to happen in the first place. That's why in August 2024, I committed together with the KZN Public Works and Infrastructure MEC Martin Meyer to convene a national summit on construction mafia activity. And the purpose was clear: to bring together public works departments, law enforcement, national treasury, regulators, public entities, SOEs, various spheres of government and the construction sector to build one coordinated national response. And that is what was born out of the Durban Summit in 2024. It brought together all of those partners, industry stakeholders, and social partners. The Durban Declaration was our line in the sand. It said that the state would no longer tolerate criminal disruption at construction sites. It said that infrastructure projects must be allowed to continue uninterrupted. And it committed stakeholders to strengthening the legal and policy environment, improving data and reporting systems, enhancing rapid response, supporting arrestation, and developing emerging enterprises and skills so that we could create a collaborative platform to solve the problems in the construction sector. Most importantly, though, it recognized the fight against the construction mafia required two forms of action at the same time. The first was law enforcement. Where there is extortion, intimidation, violence, vandalism, sabotage, or criminal interference, people must be arrested, prosecuted, and convicted. The second was prevention, that we must close the space that criminals exploit by building community buy-in from the start. Effectively, we wanted our communities to become the first line of defense for us. That meant that we then had to ensure that communities are properly informed, meaningfully engaged, and given lawful, transparent channels to raise concerns and access legitimate opportunities. We must create transparent mechanisms for local participation. And we must make sure that employment, subcontracting, and enterprise development opportunities are not captured by gatekeepers or criminals, politically connected groups, or mafia networks. Since the signing of the Durban Declaration, there has been measurable progress. There have been more than 770 cases of construction-related extortion and intimidation that were reported across the country. Of those, 241 arrests were made, and importantly, 176 people were convicted. In KwaZulu-Natal, which was historically regarded as the hotspot of this activity, monthly site disruptions have dropped from more than 60 incidents per month to fewer than 10 per month. That is a significant improvement. It shows what can happen when government, law enforcement, public entities, and the private sector work together. It shows what can happen when contractors report cases and the state responds. And it shows what happens when criminals begin to understand that construction sites are no longer spaces where they can act without consequence. Reports from the CIDB further show that this progress is not only reflected in headline statistics, but also in the way incidents are now being managed on the ground. Through its participation in the Priority Crimes Committee alongside SAPS, the Private Security Industry Regulatory Authority, private security, infrastructure clients, and private sector representatives have reported that disruptions are now being dealt with quicker and addressed through a more focused multi-stakeholder intervention. This means that while reports of construction site disruptions have reduced, the incidences that do still occur at least, are being responded to more quickly, helping to reduce delays, restore stability, and ensure that law enforcement and project stakeholders act together. But let me be clear, we're not declaring victory yet. The fight is far from over, and the recent disruptions at Gauteng, including in Randfontein and the Vaal region, shows that the risk remains. But they also show that the response system is now working differently. In those cases, incidences were escalated through the Provincial Priority Crimes Committee, and affected groups were engaged, and sites were stabilized without allowing the disruptions to spiral into prolonged stoppages. So we understand that these activities and some of these groupings are still alive and continuing, but their networks are looking for other ways now to infiltrate projects. They're still trying to exploit legitimate participation and local economic development requirements. They're still trying to position front companies. We now have criminals that have their own front companies that pose as contractors, and they manipulate community structures and influence subcontracting opportunities. They're still trying to make public infrastructure serve criminal interests instead of public interests. And that's why today's announcement is important, because Cabinet has now approved the Integrated Social Facilitation Framework, also known as the ISFF, as a binding national policy instrument to standardize and institutionalize community engagement in public infrastructure delivery across all spheres of government, state-owned entities, and infrastructure development stakeholders. This framework is designed to address community protests before they start, project disruptions, vandalism, delays, and security risks by promoting structured community participation through the infrastructure project cycle. It introduces a professionalized and coordinated approach to social facilitation, including the accreditation of social facilitators, clearer governance arrangements, stronger monitoring and evaluation, and a risk-based approach to managing community-related risks. In plain language, this means that communities must no longer be engaged only after conflict begins. They must be engaged before a project starts. They must understand what is being built, why it is being built, what opportunities exist, what the rules are, and how concerns can be raised lawfully. This is how social facilitation helps prevent construction stoppages before they even happen. As I said, this is how they become the first line of defense for us. When communities are engaged early, when they understand the benefits of a project, when local opportunities are communicated transparently, and when there are lawful channels to resolve concerns, it becomes far harder for criminal groups to exploit confusion, frustration, or exclusion to disrupt a site. For too long, community engagement in projects has been inconsistent and fragmented, and sometimes not at all. In some cases, it's treated just as a box-ticking exercise, and in others, it's left to unqualified intermediaries. In many cases, self-styled community liaison officers step into the vacuum and claim to speak on behalf of communities without any accountability, standards, or ethical obligation. That vacuum has been exploited by extortionists, and the framework closes that vacuum. It embeds social facilitation throughout the entire life cycle of a project, from pre-initiation to project closeout. And it provides a framework for proper stakeholder mapping and community profiling, so we know exactly who is legitimately in the community or not. It establishes the Project Liaison Committee as a formal communication and conflict resolution platform, and it supports the creation of targeted enterprise databases and contract participation goal plans to maximize lawful community participation. It integrates training and skills development programs for local labor, and it requires continuous monitoring and evaluation of the social issues. It requires regular reporting so that risks can be identified early and managed before they become a disruption. For us, this is a major shift, ladies and gentlemen. We're moving away from ad hoc consultation to structured engagement. We are moving away from informal gatekeeping to professional facilitation, and we are moving away from crisis management to prevention. But we're also moving away from allowing criminals to claim the language of community participation, to ensure that real communities are engaged through lawful, transparent, and accountable structures. The professionalization of social facilitation is central to this reform. That's why the South African Council for the Project and Construction Management Professions, working together with the Department, the Council for the Built Environment and other stakeholders, is leading the process to formalize social facilitation now as a recognized professional category. This will include defined competencies, qualifications, registration categories, continuing professional development, and a code of ethics. Social facilitators must be qualified. They must be registered, and they must be accountable. They must understand community dynamics, project delivery, conflict management, local participation, governance, and ethics, as we've said. But they also must be able to act as a bridge between the community and not as gatekeepers. They must act as a bridge between contractors and the community, and that they are able to do so with transparency, that they are able to gain the trust and protect our communities, that they are able to protect contractors, and they are also able to assist in protecting public money. That's how we protect infrastructure delivery. The implementation of the framework will be coordinated through the department, led by the team assembled here, and the committee includes the Department, Infrastructure, Technical Assistance Facility, the Council for the Built Environment, the CIDB, the IDT, the Association of Local Engagement Facilitators, SELGA, Myeza, which is the Municipal Infrastructure Agency, Southern Africa, the Association of Construction Project Managers, and National Treasury. This is important because the construction mafia does not operate in one sphere of government and infrastructure. It operates in many spheres and through many angles. So a national problem requires a national framework. Going forward, we will focus on 5 practical areas. First, we will prioritize implementation on high-risk projects where community conflict, extortion, vandalism, and disruption are the greatest or have stalled projects altogether. Second, we will work with public entities, provinces, municipalities, and implementing agents to ensure that social facilitation is built into project planning and procurement from the start. Third, we will work with the project manager's entity and the CBE to advance the professionalization, accreditation, and registration of social facilitators. Fourth, we will strengthen monitoring and reporting so that we can measure whether professional social facilitators are reducing disruptions, improving community satisfaction, and protecting project delivery. So customer feedback is important. Who are our customers? The community. So we also want to know whether they are in support and actually gaining from these interventions. Lastly, we will be working with the SAPS, National Treasury, the CIDB, provinces and municipalities, and the construction sector to ensure that those who commit extortion, intimidation, violence, and procurement abuses face consequences. This consequence management is already being strengthened. Since 2025, in September, 52 contractors have now been blacklisted, with a further batch currently under review. Before I came into office, it were just 2 in 22 years. We've done 52 in 2 years. Implementation guidelines for the Integrated Social Facilitation Framework are now being developed. It will be spoken to by Molatelo. Awareness webinars are being conducted across the sector, and the Council is advancing the professional registration category. The Integrated Social Facilitation Framework does not replace law enforcement. It strengthens it. It's a complement to it. Where there are legitimate community concerns, we will engage. Where local businesses seek lawful participation, we will create those opportunities. And where young people want skills and work opportunities, we will link infrastructure projects to real skills development. But where criminals invade sites, threaten our workers, demand money, or attempt to manipulate outcomes, or vandalize infrastructure, we will make sure that they are arrested. There can be no negotiation with extortionists or criminals. There will be no compromise with them either. And there will be no future for a construction industry where delivery depends on paying protection money. South Africa's construction sites must be places of work, dignity, and delivery. They must not be places of fear or criminal control. They must not be places where politically connected syndicates decide who may build or who may work and who must pay. 2 years ago, the so-called construction mafia had become one of the greatest threats to infrastructure delivery and investment in South Africa. That story has since changed, as I have explained. And now, with Cabinet's approval of the framework, we are institutionalizing the prevention side of our fight. This is how we turn the tide. The Durban Declaration evolved from a commitment to a government response. To the construction sector, our message is very clear. We are serious and committed to restoring confidence. We've proven that, and we will continue to do so. To our communities, your voices matter, and this framework is a direct response to the frustrations that have been raised with us. To our workers and investors, we are working to make construction sites safer, more stable, and more attractive. Let me say this in closing. We are determined to build. At all costs, we will not stop. We're determined to protect our infrastructure, but also we are also determined to restore the rule of law. Because South Africa must be a country where construction sites create jobs, grow the economy, and serve the community.